Uriah was not born in Israel. His blood did not carry the legacy of Abraham, nor had his ancestors walked through the desert under the leadership of Moses. He was a Hittite, descended from a people who had once been enemies of the nation he now served. A foreigner, yes, but not a stranger among the warriors. From an early age, Uriah understood that the land one calls home is not always the one he was born in, but the one he is willing to fight for. And fight he did. Strong, agile, loyal, his name echoed among King David's soldiers. He was not just any man, he was one of David's valiant men, an elite warrior, one of those who advanced when others retreated, who held the sword even when his arm was weak. War was his trade. He knew the sound of spears clashing, the weight of the shield pressing down on his muscles, the smell of blood mixed with the dust of the battlefield. But despite everything, Uriah was not a man hardened by war. There was something different about him, something that made him admired not just for his strength, but for his character. Check out more Bible stories full of emotion by subscribing to the channel now and activating the bell to receive all notifications. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with a donation by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. In the midst of so many battles, there was one thing that always made him want to go home. Jerusalem was his refuge, and inside the fortified city, in a simple house, someone was waiting for him, Bathsheba. His heart beat faster as he remembered her. Her soft touch, her gaze that spoke without words, her presence that made the days of rest lighter. No matter how many wars he faced, how many nights he slept under the cold stars of the desert, his greatest victory was to return to her. But for now, he couldn't. The army was still marching, and Uriah was marching with it. The dust of the battlefield mingled with the sweat of the warriors. The sun burned down on the dry land, and the clang of swords could be heard in the heavy air of war. Urias was in the middle of it all, as always, fighting with the intensity of someone who has no doubts about his mission. For him, war was not just a duty, it was a matter of honor. While many soldiers were counting down the days to go home, Urias remained focused. He knew that every battle won meant safety for those he loved. Jerusalem, his home, his wife, all this was protected by the sharp edge of his sword and the determination that guided him. The men around him respected his bravery, but more than that, they admired his loyalty. Not just to King David, but to everything he held sacred. Uriah was not a man who put his own interests above the collective. He didn't let himself get carried away by tiredness or the desire for rest. No, he was a warrior to the last hair. And that's why, while others looked for ways to escape the rigors of battle, Uriah stood firm. In that war against the Ammonites, the siege of Rabbah continued. The enemy was resisting, and Joab, commander of David's army, knew he needed his best men on the front line. Uriah was one of those men, the kind of warrior who wouldn't back down, who wasn't afraid to die for a cause he believed in. The nights were long and cold, and the stories around the campfire often spoke of what each man would do when he returned home. But Urias didn't daydream. He knew there was still fighting ahead. The return to Jerusalem would have to wait. The wind blew gently through the streets of Jerusalem, carrying with it the smell of fresh bread and spices. The city followed its usual rhythm, but in a discreet house not far from the royal palace, someone was waiting. Bathsheba was a woman used to absence. Loving a warrior meant learning to measure time, not by the days that passed, but by the times he returned home. Uriah had gone off to war once again, and she stayed, as she always did, counting the moons and waiting for his return. The nights without him were long, but his memory was a constant companion. His firm touch, his sure gaze, his words full of silent promises that he would always come back. And he always did. There was never any reason to doubt it. Uriah was not just a husband, he was a man of his word. But that night, when the silence of the city was already enveloping everything like a veil, something happened. Footsteps approached. Not the footsteps she expected, not those of Uriah crossing the threshold with the smell of battle on his skin. They were different, heavy footsteps laden with authority. The call came from the corridors of the palace. A servant of King David was looking for her. The message was clear. The king wanted to see her. Her heart raced. The king himself? Why would he call her? Time seemed to move slowly as she left her house and walked towards the palace. The imposing walls seemed to watch her in silence. Inside those walls, David was waiting for her. The palace hall was spacious, lit by the flickering flame of the lamps. The scent of fine woods mingled with the incense burning in the corners of the room. There was a heavy silence inside, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. In the center, sitting on richly embroidered cushions, was David. Bathsheba entered hesitantly. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her hands were cold, even on that warm Jerusalem night. Never before had she been so close to the king. Never before had she been called there. She tried to decipher the reason for their meeting, but David's gaze said little, or perhaps it said everything. He stood up slowly, crossing the space that separated them. The king, the man after God's own heart, was now faced with a desire he shouldn't have. But who could say no to the king of Israel? The silence between them lasted only a few moments, but in that short space of time, a decision had already been made. A desire that had been growing in David's heart had now become real. That night, everything changed. The mistake that had started out small, almost imperceptible, took shape within those golden walls. The man who had defeated giants, written psalms of repentance and justice, now fell before an invisible battle. A fight waged not against an external enemy, but against himself. When Bathsheba left the palace, the night wind blew over her as if trying to erase the traces of that night. But some marks are not so easily erased. Time passed, and life went on as it always does. Until, weeks later, an unexpected sign brought to light the consequences of that encounter. Bathsheba felt something different in her body, a delay, an uneasiness, a silent fear that turned into certainty. She was pregnant. The message reached the palace like thunder on a cloudless day. Bathsheba was pregnant. David felt the impact of the news like an invisible spear. For weeks, the secret of that night remained buried under the royal routine, hidden between appointments, meetings with advisors, and the constant movement of servants around the palace. But now, what had only been a momentary wish had become something real, something impossible to ignore. The king paced back and forth, his footsteps heavy against the stone floor. If the pregnancy was discovered, Bathsheba's honor would be ruined, but not only hers. Uriah, her husband, was still at war, far from Jerusalem. Everyone would know that the child was not his. David's name, his image as a just king and servant of God, would be tarnished. He needed a plan, something fast, something that would erase the evidence before it was too late. That's when the idea came to him, simple, almost obvious. If Uriah came home and lay with his wife, everyone would think the child was his. The problem would be solved before it even began. Without wasting any time, David sent a messenger to the battlefield. Uriah was to return to Jerusalem immediately. The news would certainly take him by surprise, but the soldier would obey without question. After all, the order came from the king himself, and so the trap began to be set. In a matter of days, Uriah would be back, crossing the city gates, believing he was just another soldier getting a well-deserved rest. But David knew the truth, and as he awaited the warrior's return, a restlessness grew inside him. He had found a way out of the problem, at least that's what he thought. Uriah arrived in Jerusalem in the midday heat. The sun shone high in the sky, casting short shadows over the cobbled streets. The king's call was unexpected, but like a loyal soldier, he didn't question it. He simply obeyed. As he passed through the city gates, he felt a wave of relief. Jerusalem was his home, the place where his wife was waiting for him, but there was something strange in the air. The looks on the faces of the palace servants, the whispers cut off in mid-sentence. something he couldn't quite put his finger on, but which ignited his warrior instinct. David welcomed him with a broad smile and friendly words. He asked about the war, about the men on the battlefield, about Joab, the commander. It was a normal conversation, but Uriah sensed that there was something beyond those words. Even so, he listened respectfully, answered with the precision of a soldier, and waited for the real reason for his summons. It was then that the king extended the invitation. "You fought bravely, Urias. Go home tonight. Rest." The warrior's heart squeezed. He missed Bathsheba. He missed the warmth of home. But how could he rest while his brothers in arms slept on the hard ground, far from their families? How could he lie in his bed when the Ark of the Covenant, symbol of God's presence, was still on the battlefield? So he didn't go home. Instead, he lay down with the palace servants at the entrance to the court, refusing the comfort he had been offered. The next morning, David heard about the refusal. He frowned. His plan, so simple in theory, was beginning to unravel. But the king would not give up so easily. David drummed his fingers on the table. Uriah had slept at the palace entrance, refusing to go home. The plan, which had seemed so simple, was now falling apart in the face of the man's unwavering integrity. But the king would not give up. That night, he called Uriah again. The tone was more relaxed, almost brotherly. The king offered a banquet, plenty of wine, and words full of camaraderie. The warrior deserved it after all. Who would refuse a little rest after so many days of battle? Uriah accepted the king's hospitality, but the drink ran hot down his throat, and he didn't realize that David was expecting something more than a simple get-together. The wine flowed, and with it the king's hope that the soldiers' rigidity would finally break. The night advanced. Urias's voice became looser, his gaze a little more lost. But when he rose from the table, still shaky from the effects of the drink, his sense of duty remained firm. He wouldn't go home. He wouldn't look for his wife. Instead, he lay down right there, next to the king's servants, refusing the comfort offered to him. David gritted his teeth. The situation was getting out of hand. Uriah didn't realize the game that was being played against him. His loyalty, which was supposed to protect him, now condemned him. The king walked around the palace that night, pondering his next steps. If Uriah wouldn't cover up the secret, then the secret would have to disappear in another way. The next morning, his expression cold and his mind made up, David took out a scroll and began to write. The words were dry, direct, an order. He folded the paper and sealed it with his royal ring. When Uriah appeared to say goodbye and returned to battle, the king handed him the message. He left without knowing it, without suspecting that he was carrying in his hands the letter that decreed his own death. Uriah rode back to the battlefield, feeling the hot Jerusalem wind turn into the harsh dust of the roads leading to Rabbah. The parchment the king had entrusted to him was well guarded, sealed with the royal insignia. He didn't open it. There was no point in doing so. When a soldier receives direct orders from the king, he carries them out without question. When he arrived, he handed the message to Joab, the army commander. Joab's gaze traveled over the lines written by David's own hand, and his face remained impassive. He was a man of war, used to difficult missions, but those words carried a different weight. Put Uriah on the front line, in the deadliest place in the battle, and then retreat. The words were clear. Uriah was to die. Joab knew that this was no ordinary order. You didn't just send one of David's mighty men to his death for no reason. But Joab also knew that certain orders are not questioned. You just carry them out. And so, it was done. The warriors advanced against the Ammonites, and Uriah was among them, as he had always been, ready to fight. But this time something was different. The men around him retreated at the decisive moment, leaving him exposed. The enemy blade found his body. One sharp blow, then another. Uriah staggered, but his hand didn't let go of the sword. He resisted. He was a warrior. But even the strongest don't win alone. His body fell to the blood-red earth. His eyes, once full of life and determination, now stared at the sky without seeing anything else. The news soon reached Jerusalem. Joab sent a messenger to the king. He was to report on the battle, but if David was annoyed by the strategy used, he was only to say one sentence: "Uriah the Hittite is dead." And that's what happened. The messenger arrived at the palace. David listened. He took a deep breath. His plan had worked. The news spread through Jerusalem like a cold wind on a silent night. Uriah, the faithful warrior, the valiant among the valiant, was dead. Bathsheba received the news with a heavy silence. Her heart seemed to break into invisible pieces. Grief came like a dark wave, and she wept. She wept like any woman who loses a husband. But there was something different about her cry, something no one else knew. For days, she dressed in black, fulfilling the period of mourning. The neighbors whispered, the servants looked on, but deep down, everyone knew that life went on, and indeed it did. Time passed, and when the days of mourning were over, a new call came from the palace. David brought her into his home, took her as his wife, and before the eyes of the people, everything seemed to fall into place. A powerful king comforting a widow, a gesture of nobility and care. There were murmurs, of course, but no one dared question the king of Israel. After all, who could doubt David's goodness? And so the clock ticked. Bathsheba's belly grew, her womb rounded out. The king's son was on the way. From the outside, everything seemed settled. The scandal covered up, the mistake disguised, Uriah's fate sealed in oblivion. But God was watching. In that same palace where David felt safe, footsteps echoed through the corridors. Footsteps that didn't come from a soldier or a servant. The prophet Nathan was approaching. His eyes carried something that none of the king's advisors would dare to bring. He came with words that no man would want to hear. And as he entered the royal chambers, Nathan began to speak. A story. A parable about a rich man and a poor man. Nathan stood before the king. The silence between them was thick, as if the very air of the palace was waiting for the impact of what was to come. The prophet didn't need to raise his voice, because his words already carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. "There were two men in a town," he began. "One was rich and had many sheep and oxen. The other poor had only one little lamb, which he had raised with care. It ate from his plate, drank from his cup, and slept in his arms. She was like a daughter to him." David listened attentively, his expression firm, but the prophet continued unhurriedly, letting each word find its place. One day, a traveler arrived at the rich man's house, and instead of taking one of his many sheep to prepare a feast, he took the poor man's only lamb and sacrificed it to serve his guest. The king shifted in his chair, his chest heaving with indignation. His sense of justice screamed before he could even contain the words, "That man deserves to die." The silence that followed was different, heavy, sharp. Then Nathan raised his eyes and without hesitation spoke the words that pierced the king's soul like no sword ever could. "That man is you." The weight of the truth fell on David with the force of a storm. There was no more running away, no more excuses, no more deceit. God had seen. God knew. Uriah was dead, but his story didn't end there. His name echoed like a reminder of what could not be erased. Divine justice did not bend to the power of kings, and now David would have to face not only God's judgment, but the consequences of his own actions. The past could not be undone. David bowed his head. The weight of guilt crushed him like a mountain on his shoulders. The mighty king, God's anointed, was now nothing more than a man stripped naked before the truth. The sin he had tried to hide came to light, and the consequences began to unfold like an overflowing river, taking everything in its path. The son he had with Bathsheba fell seriously ill. David fasted, wept, and cried out to God, but the sentence had already been passed. The child died, and the pain he had caused others now came back to him with a force impossible to contain. David's house was never the same again. God himself declared that the sword would never depart from his family. And so it was. Betrayals, violence, blood between his own sons, all the consequence of that moment when the king let his heart be taken over by desire and arrogance. And Uriah? His name has not been lost in time. His story was marked not only by tragedy, but by unwavering fidelity. He didn't live to see divine justice, but his life became an eternal testimony to loyalty and honor. Uriah was faithful when no one else was. He stood firm when even a king wavered. His commitment to duty cost him his life, but his memory has spanned the centuries. And what have we learned from him? Honor is priceless, and doing the right thing is priceless. Even the powerful fall, but those who live justly are remembered. Time can erase great kingdoms, but it can never erase the name of those who lived with honor. In the end, there is a king greater than any king on earth. A king who sees everything, who judges and brings to light everything that has been hidden. And that king never forgot Uriah. If you liked Uriah's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.